Picture this. The year is 1307. Dawn breaks over the port of La Rochelle on France's Atlantic coast. The harbour that once bustled with merchant vessels and fishing boats now holds something far more mysterious. 18 ships bob silently in the morning mist, their hulls heavy with secrets, their sails pregnant with purpose. These aren't ordinary vessels. They belong to the Knights Templar, and in just hours, they will vanish from history forever. You've heard fragments of this story before. The arrest of the Templars on Friday the 13th, the torture chambers, the burning pyres. But what you haven't heard is what happened to their fleet, because while King Philip's soldiers were kicking down doors in Paris, something extraordinary was taking place along the French coastline. A maritime exodus so carefully orchestrated, so perfectly timed, that it would baffle historians for 7 centuries. Tonight, as your mind settles into the rhythm of waves against ancient hulls, we're going to follow those ghost ships across dark waters. We'll trace their wake through storm-tossed seas and into harbours that history forgot to record. This isn't just about missing vessels or lost treasure. This is about the greatest naval mystery of the medieval world. One that stretches from the fjords of Norway to the hidden coves of Scotland, from Portuguese monasteries to the windswept shores of the New World itself. So let your breathing match the gentle roll of a ship at anchor. Let your thoughts drift like morning fog across the water, because the story we're about to unfold will carry you through centuries of silence, across oceans of time, to places where the line between legend and truth grows as thin as sea spray. The Templars weren't just warrior monks, they were bankers, diplomats, and perhaps most importantly, they were sailors. By the dawn of the 14th century, their maritime network stretched across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic like an invisible web. They owned ports, controlled trade routes, and commanded a fleet that rivaled those of entire kingdoms. Venice feared them, Genoa respected them, and King Philip of France, drowning in debt to their coffers, plotted their destruction with the cold calculation of a man who knew exactly what he was stealing. But the Templars had something Philip didn't expect. They had warning. Sources differ on exactly how much advance notice they received, but evidence suggests it was substantial. Enough time to empty their vaults, burn their most sensitive documents, and prepare for what would come next. And what came next was the most audacious escape in medieval history. The fleet that gathered at La Rochelle wasn't random. These were specific ships, chosen for specific purposes. The largest vessels, some say, carried the Templar treasure, though no one agrees on what that treasure actually was. Gold and silver, certainly. Religious relics, possibly. But perhaps something more valuable than either. Something that exists, not in coffers, but in knowledge, in bloodlines, in truths too dangerous for the daylight of orthodox history. The smaller ships carried people, not just the obvious refugees, the knights and sergeants who would face torture if they remained, but families, craftsmen, scholars, entire communities that had grown up around Templar commanderies, people whose lives were so intertwined with the order that they had no choice but to follow their protectors into exile. As the sun climbed higher on that October morning, the ships began to move, not in panic, not in desperate flight, but with the measured precision of a plan long in preparation. They slipped from their moorings like ghosts returning to the realm of myth. Harbour officials, if they noticed at all, said nothing. Local fishermen, wise in the ways of survival, looked the other way. By noon, the fleet had cleared the coastal waters. By evening, they had vanished into the vast anonymity of the Atlantic. Where did they go? That question has haunted researchers for centuries. Some sailed north, that much seems certain. Portugal beckoned, where the Templars would soon be reborn as the Order of Christ under royal protection. Scotland called, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and desperate, might welcome skilled warriors regardless of their past. And beyond Scotland, lay stranger possibilities still. The most persistent legends speak of Ireland's hidden harbours, of ships that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. Local chronicles, written decades later, mention strangers who came by sea, men who spoke Latin and French, who carried themselves with military bearing, who seemed to possess wealth beyond their numbers. They built nothing permanent, these visitors. They left no monuments, no churches, no obvious traces. But they left whispers. Other tales lead further still, to the fog-shrouded coastlines of Iceland, where Templar crosses have been found carved into stones that predate Columbus by 2 centuries. To Greenland, where Norse settlements suddenly acquired new techniques for metalworking, new symbols in their art, new prayers whispered in languages the Vikings never learned. To places that weren't supposed to exist on medieval maps, but somehow found their way into Templar charts, recovered centuries later from Portuguese archives. The most audacious theory of all suggests that some of those ships didn't stop at the edge of the known world, that they pushed further west, into waters that wouldn't officially be discovered for another 2 centuries. The evidence is fragmentary, controversial, dismissed by mainstream historians as wishful thinking. But it exists. Stone markers bearing Templar symbols found in Nova Scotia, carvings that match no known indigenous art, but bear striking resemblances to medieval European stonework. Legends among native peoples of bearded strangers who arrived long before the official age of exploration. Consider this. The Templars possessed the most advanced navigational knowledge of their time. They had access to Islamic astronomical texts, to Byzantine sailing manuals, to Norse exploration accounts that spoke of lands beyond the sunset. They had ships built for long ocean voyages, crews trained in deep water sailing, and most crucially, they had desperate need for a refuge beyond the reach of European politics. The Atlantic in 1307 wasn't the barrier that most people imagine. Viking ships had been crossing it for centuries. Irish monks had island-hopped their way to Iceland and beyond. The knowledge existed, the technology existed, the motivation existed. What was missing was official sanction, royal backing, the kind of support that would leave records for historians to find centuries later. But the Templars didn't need official sanction. They were beyond such concerns now. Outlaws fleeing for their lives, carrying secrets that couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. If sanctuary lay across an ocean, then across an ocean they would go. The ships that sailed from La Rochelle that October morning carried more than refugees and treasure. They carried possibilities, questions that echo across the centuries like the sound of waves against distant shores. The Portuguese connection offers our first solid clues. When the Templar fleet scattered from La Rochelle, several ships made directly for the Iberian coast. King Dinis of Portugal had been watching events in France with calculating eyes. He understood what his neighbour Philip was truly after: the wealth, the infrastructure, the maritime expertise that the Templars had spent 2 centuries accumulating. While other monarchs stood by or actively participated in the persecution, Dinis saw opportunity. By 1319, just 12 years after the dissolution, Portugal had founded the Order of Christ. Same symbols, same organizational structure, many of the same people. The transformation was so seamless that it barely deserves the name rebirth. This was continuation by other means, survival through political alchemy. The Red Cross pate of the Templars simply acquired a white border and sailed on as if nothing had changed. But Portugal was just the beginning, the official face of Templar survival. The real mystery lies in what happened to the ships that didn't seek royal protection, that chose deeper exile over comfortable accommodation. These vessels carried something that couldn't be legitimized, couldn't be blessed by papal bulls or royal charters. They carried the shadow archives, the knowledge that had made the original order too dangerous to allow continued existence. Follow the Celtic currents northward from the Bay of Biscay. The waters here have their own memory. their own way of guiding ships toward hidden harbours. Ireland's western coast is a maze of inlets and islands, places where a fleet could disappear for months without attracting notice. The old Gaelic lords asked few questions of visitors who paid in silver and caused no trouble. Monastic scribes, if they recorded these arrivals at all, did so in codes that modern scholars still struggle to decipher. One manuscript, discovered in a Cork monastery in 1847 and promptly lost again during the Great Famine, spoke of the men of the Red Cross who came seeking the island of the Blessed. The phrase haunted the few scholars who read it. Which island? What blessing? The text offered no clarification, only the image of ships arriving in the pre-dawn darkness, their crews speaking a mixture of French and Latin, their cargo carefully guarded from curious eyes. Scottish waters tell a different story, one written in stone and steel rather than parchment. Rosslyn Chapel, that enigmatic jewel of medieval architecture, began construction in 1446, well over a century after the Templar dissolution. Yet its walls crawl with symbols that have nothing to do with conventional Christian iconography. Masonic squares, Templar crosses, carvings that depict plants native to the Americas decades before Columbus made his famous voyage. The Sinclair family, builders of Rosslyn, had connections that stretched back to the Crusades. Henry Sinclair, 1st Earl of Orkney, reportedly mounted an expedition to the New World in 1398. The evidence is fragmentary, controversial, built more on legend than documentation. But legends, like ocean currents, follow patterns that reveal deeper truths. Consider the Zeno narrative, a document published in Venice in 1558 that describes a 14th century voyage to lands beyond Greenland. The account mentions a prince from the Northern Islands, almost certainly Henry Sinclair, who discovered territories rich in resources and populated by peoples unknown to European maps. Mainstream historians dismiss the narrative as a later fabrication, but its geographic details align with places that wouldn't be officially discovered for another century. The most tantalizing possibility leads to Oak Island, that mysterious spit of land off the Nova Scotia coast, where treasure hunters have been digging for over 2 centuries. The famous Money Pit, with its layers of oak platforms and flood tunnels, bears all the hallmarks of medieval engineering. The coconut fibre found at various depths, the parchment fragments, the lead cross inscribed with symbols that match Templar iconography. None of it proves anything definitively, but taken together, it suggests a deliberate burial, something so valuable that its guardians were willing to create one of history's most elaborate hiding places. What could be worth such effort? Gold and silver, certainly, but the Templars had accumulated far more than mere wealth during their 2 centuries of existence. They had been the bridge between Christian and Islamic learning, the custodians of knowledge that the Crusades had brought from the East. Mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, alchemical formulas, navigational techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream European science for generations. More dangerous still were the documents that questioned orthodox Christian doctrine. The Templars had spent decades in the Holy Land, in constant contact with Gnostic traditions, Islamic philosophy, Jewish mysticism. They had access to texts that the Church had spent centuries suppressing, ideas that could undermine the very foundations of papal authority. In their archives lay gospels that told different stories, genealogies that traced different bloodlines, accounts of the early church that contradicted everything Rome taught. These weren't just historical curiosities. In the medieval world, such knowledge was power, the kind of power that could topple kingdoms and remake the spiritual landscape of Europe. No wonder Philip and his papal allies were so determined to destroy the order completely. And no wonder the Templars were equally determined to preserve what they could beyond the reach of earthly persecution. The ships that sailed into Atlantic darkness carried libraries as well as treasure chests, scholars as well as soldiers. They were floating monasteries, maritime universities preserving fragments of human knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. Some of those fragments may still lie buried in Nova Scotian earth or sealed in Icelandic caves, waiting for the day when the world is ready to receive them. So here you rest, at the edge of 7 centuries of silence, where the wake of those vanished ships finally fades into the vast mystery of time itself. The Templar fleet that slipped from La Rochelle on that October morning in 1307 didn't simply disappear. It dissolved into legend, scattered its secrets across oceans and continents, left its mark in stone circles and buried chambers, in whispered traditions and encrypted manuscripts that still surface in forgotten archives. We may never know exactly where those 18 ships found their final harbours. Perhaps some lie beneath Canadian soil, their hulls long since returned to Earth. Others might rest in Scottish lochs or Irish bogs, their treasures sealed by centuries of silt and silence. The knowledge they carried, the secrets they protected, may be lost forever or waiting still in vaults that no modern eye has seen. But their greatest treasure wasn't gold or relics or forbidden gospels. It was the audacity to believe that some truths are worth preserving beyond the reach of kings and popes. That knowledge belongs not to those who would suppress it, but to those who would guard it for future generations. In choosing exile over extinction, the Templars became something more than a military order. They became custodians of possibility, keepers of the flame that refuses to be extinguished, as sleep carries you toward your own distant shores. Remember this. Sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but to be preserved, passed down, like whispered prayers from one generation to the next, waiting for the moment when the world is finally ready to receive what was never truly lost, only hidden beneath the endless rhythm of waves against time.